Hi everyone, I'm Mariam Masoni from the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and I want to welcome you to the 49th New York Film Festival and to one of our forums that we're doing in the festival this year in honor of having this incredible new space, the Eleanor Bunin Monroe Film Center. So I welcome you all to this. Before we get to the issues at hand, I do have an announcement that I am going to read because I haven't memorized it. The New York Film Festival is proud to announce that for the second time in our 49-year history, and I don't know when the first time was, we have the privilege of presenting a work in progress from a master filmmaker. The film is due to be released in theaters this year. We hope you will join us at Avery Fisher Hall on Monday, October 10 at 7 p.m. Film Society of Lincoln Center members can purchase tickets tomorrow, October 6, beginning at 10 a.m. at Avery Fisher Hall box office. Tickets for non-members will be on sale at the Avery Fisher Hall box office beginning Friday, October 7 at 9:30 a.m. And Avery Fisher Hall is like the big place that's just right on the other side of this building, on the side of the street. So I don't know what it is either, so, but I'm told it's big. When we decided to contact various of our constituents and organizations that we partner with from time to time to invite them to do a panel during the New York Film Festival, I sent out some emails, and it was like she was waiting at her desk. I got a call from Terry Lawler, the executive director of New York Women in Film and Television. And with Ann Hubble and Eileen Newman, we had a bunch of confabs, and they came up with this fabulous idea and this fabulous panel. So to get us started, I'm going to introduce, and then she can get us moving, the executive director of New York Women in Film and Television, Terry Lawler.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I want to thank the Film Society of Lincoln Center for giving us this opportunity to put together this panel and get in front of all you folks. For those of you who don't know, New York Women in Film and Television is a membership organization for women in film, television, and new media. We have 2,000 members in the New York City area, and we're part of a network of 40 chapters with 10,000 members around the world. And we have women and men in our membership. And we do networking and professional development workshops and seminars like these. We advocate for equity for women in the business. We celebrate women's work, and we preserve films by women. And we did preserve Sara Driver's film, You Are Not I, which is screening at 9 o'clock tonight. I want to thank Mariam Masoni and Eugene Hernandez for their help with this, and also Eileen Newman and Ann Hubble from our board of directors who helped put this together. And now I'd like to introduce our fabulous moderator, Drake Stutesman. She is the editor of the Film Journal and Film and Media Journal Framework, and co-chair of the Women's Film Preservation Fund. And she's currently teaching costume design and film at NYU. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see so many people here. It's terrific. This is an amazing topic, I think. I want to introduce the panelists. I think we really collected a great group of people with very diverse points of view and experience to this topic, which every time we've gotten together, we just talk for an hour without stopping. So I know it's going to be a very juicy conversation. So I'm actually going to read their bios. Usually I don't, but there's a lot of information, and we have a lot of time tonight, so I'm going to read out, and I'm going to start with Roberta Friedman. Roberta is an award-winning filmmaker and professor of film at Montclair State University, and is a major figure in the Los Angeles Avant Garde film community. She has worked on HBO and PBS programs and on films such as Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Days of Heaven. The Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences is currently preserving all of her avant-garde films, which have been shown worldwide in venues including the Guggenheim Museum, the Centre Pompidou, the Whitney Museum of American Art. So, Roberta. See, already everyone's interest is wildly piqued. This is great. So next, sitting next to Roberta is Ina Archer. Ina, you're on the next page. Ina Archer's multimedia works and films have been shown nationally in Cinema Project's Expanded Frames, a celebration and examination of critical cinema in Portland, Oregon, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women Artists and the Moving Image since 1970 at Spelman College Museum of Fine Art and the Contemporary Art Museum, Houston. Her awards include residences at Vermont Studio Center, Blue Mountain Centers, and Civitella Ranieri in Umbria in Italy. Archer is an adjunct faculty in Foundations at Parsons, the New School of Design. She is a longtime member, very long-time member of the New York Women in Film and Television's Women Film Preservation Fund and a board member of IMAP, the Independent Media Arts Preservation. So again, a very complex history. And sitting next to Ina is MM Serra. She is an experimental filmmaker, curator, author, and the executive director of the Filmmakers Cooperative, the world's oldest and largest archive of independent media. Sarah's new film, Bitch Beauty, premiered at the New York Film Festival, this one, on October the 3rd, and is also showing on October the 7th and October the 10th. So there's still plenty of time to see it. You have tonight's film, and you have these other opportunities. It's screening, obviously, under the title of the Views of the Avant Garde. This is where her film is, and of course, this is what we're talking about tonight, whether this is indeed the right way to title a film. Her film, quote, Chop Off, that's the title, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and screened at the Tribeca Film Festival in the Museum of Modern Art's documentary Fortnight series in 2009. In fall 2010, Sarah curated Counterculture, Counter Cinema, an avant-garde film festival at the Pacific Design Center with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. In 2007-2008, Sarah was the curator of a 6-part experimental film series titled Cinema of the Unusual at PS1. Sarah also curated and traveled with the show, quote, The New York Experimental in Warsaw and Poznan, Poland. Sarah's chapter on the work of Carolee Schneemann, entitled I, Body, The Cinematic Paintings of Carolee Schneemann, was published in Anthology of Experimental Filmmakers by Duke University Press. Sitting next to MM is Sara Driver, who directed You Are Not I, which is showing tonight at 9 p.m. in this, I think in the next door theater. Oh, it's at Walter Reed. Walter Reed. And it's showing in the Masterworks section of the New York Film Festival. Sleepwalk, which won the prestigious Cinémathèque Française Prix Georges Saudoul and was featured at the Museum of Modern Art's 1987 New Directors New Films series. Her award-winning film When Pigs Fly, starring Marianne Faithfull and Alfred Molina, premiered at the Locarno Film Festival in 1993. She produced Jim Jarmusch's Stranger Than Paradise and Permanent Vacation, and the Jarmusch directed Tom Waits music video, It's All Right With Me. And on the far end is Jon Gartenberg, who is a distributor, programmer, and archivist. Formerly curator at MoMA, he acquired avant-garde movies for the permanent collection and was involved in the preservation of the films of Andy Warhol. Later, as director of the film preservation program of the Estate Project for Artists with AIDS, Gartenberg oversaw the restorations of films of a number of artists, including Warren Sonbert, whose last work, Whiplash, had its world premiere at the New York Film Festival. Since 2003, Gartenberg has programmed experimental films for the Tribeca Film Festival, at which he presented in collaboration with the New York Women Film and Television's Women Film Preservation Fund, restoration screenings of Cinda Firestone's Attica and Betty Gordon's Variety, as well as in 2011, a program of restored shorts by women experimental filmmakers from the 1950s to the 1980s. There we go. It's really a wonderful collection of different perspectives and talents. It really is. So one of the things I just wanted to set up before we actually go into the first questions is just we're really looking at, in one sense, two main points here. We're looking at really what is avant-garde, and in one sense you could easily say, oh, I know the answer to that, but in another sense it's actually a very complicated and not easily answered question, and this is something the panelists really, really want to talk about. And the other is, of course, how does avant-garde influence mainstream cinema? Is it a cross-current relationship? What is the relationship? And again, you think it's an easily answered question, but it's really not. So in some sense, just to sort of set it up, there's some points that I'd just like to make, that some of them have been brought forth by each of the panelists. I asked them what they particularly wanted to focus on. And so I'm just going to itemize some of these ideas, and then we'll go into the first question. But just to think about avant-garde, I mean, in one sense, you could just say avant-garde really is, it's certainly there from the beginning of cinema, the very, very beginning. And in one sense, you could really argue, with not too much difficulty, that it is, in fact, what cinema is, which is it's full of tricks. You know, when cinema first started, I mean, what is it? It's dissolves, jump cuts, ellipsis, close-ups. And I mean, I know I've read some reports that people in the very, very early cinema, where they would go in and they would see a close-up and people would run out of the theater because they were so frightened to see something that really had no place in their imagination before, which was a gigantic disembodied head. So, you know, we're all used to this, but in fact, what is it? It's very strange. So as we've become used to things, we just incorporate them, and this is part of what this conversation is going to be, which is, in what way do we incorporate them? In what way do we take them for granted? In what ways are we endlessly shocked? What is really happening? So some of the points that people wanted to make was that it is not... experimental films really should be more linked in the public consciousness with what we call narrative. In other words, we're using terms here, and those terms can be fluid or they can be very staunch, and how do we want to use them? That genres actually that we take for granted, like let's say a horror genre, actually owes a tremendous debt to the avant-garde, and we're going to discuss that. Avant-garde films also, again, this is easily traceable, have made more than just an avant-garde in terms of the look of things, but they've made an avant-garde into the way things are perceived culturally. They have allowed laws to change because people have been hauled off to jail because they've shown the wrong thing in the avant-garde cinema, and then it becomes front page news and people get upset, and then people think about it a little more, and then, you know, 10 years later, like, everybody's doing it, right? But indeed, it has its roots in someone who intrepidly went, you know what, I'm doing it this way. That avant-garde cinema is also already well grounded in what we take to be mainstream. In other words, it's already infiltrated by people who are avant-garde filmmakers who are working in mainstream as artisans. They bring this tremendous craft, and we're going to talk about that. Also, I think I think this may be obvious to some, but not to others, which is there are many films that don't fall into the category of avant-garde, but really could easily be made to be such. We have many films that have shown here at the New York Film Festival are films that are very fractured narratives. You have, you know, a David Lynch Inland Empire. You have Claire Denis' The Intruder. You have Lars von Trier. I mean, you know, the list is, you could go on. And we accept them as, I don't know, we might call them art films or something, but we don't necessarily go, they should be in the avant-garde sidebar. We take them to be something else. So that's another thing. How did that happen? How did they end up in a category different than, let's say, somebody's films who's on this panel? How did they end up in these different categories? So that's some of the things that we're also going to be looking at. And another thing is, of course, that avant-garde has usually been very much in the vanguard of changing technologies. So things that were pre-optical and pre-digital were in fact very much used in avant-garde cinema, and then we now take them for granted in these more computerized forms. So I'm going to start. Oh, I did want to say one other thing that I think is kind of interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Drive, which is this new Ryan Gosling film, and there's a little quote from him which is really interesting. He wears in this movie a jacket, like a quilted satin jacket that has a giant stitched scorpion on the back. And this is a jacket that's very much supposed to be who this guy is. This is, you know, actually in a way, without the jacket, you really wouldn't have the film. The jacket's really important. And he said that the reason the jacket, you know, somebody said, well, why the scorpion? You know, Ryan, what's with the great scorpion? And he said The scorpion was an inside homage, this is what he used, this word homage, to the film Scorpio Rising by, I've forgotten his name, what's his name?
Kenneth Anger.
Kenneth Anger, of course, his name is engraved on my mind, but in any case, not at this moment. Kenneth Anger, and that this was a sort of an inside homage to Scorpio Rising. This is why he wears this jacket in this movie Drive. So, I mean, you're thinking like, well, it's, why he found it so important is of interest to begin with. Like, why in this particular movie would he want this moment to be carried, sort of carried as a thread throughout the movie is very interesting. But in any case, it shows that it's on people's minds all the time. So I'd like to open the panel and talk about just a general question, just talk about how, what the avant garde means to you, and how, just in general, how you place yourself within that word, if it's comfortable, not comfortable. And I'd like to start with you, John.
Thank you, Drake. Unlike the other, all the other official panelists here, I'm not a filmmaker. The films I made in college, as I've said many times, are buried in my own personal archives that nobody will ever find. But what that does mean is that in a certain way, I feel very blessed because I'm able to look at each of these filmmakers, whoever they are, distinct visions, and think about how their work relates to the human condition. And I'm not burdened with the idea of going out and having to raise funds for my next film and take time off from my day job to try to make a movie. So in a lot of different contexts in which I've worked, I've thought a lot about, because I've worked on projects with commercial film and also a special passion of mine, which is experimental film. And I just wanted to make 4 or 5 quick comments of how I see or perceive of experimental filmmaking in contradistinction to commercial films. First of all, what I would say is, for me, it's a matter of consciousness. It's a matter of the consciousness of the individual filmmaker. That for me, experimental filmmakers are more artists making films than they are people going out trying to make money. The second thing I would say is that looking at many, many experimental films over a long period of time, I think what distinguishes experimental filmmakers is that they are very conscious. There are issues of techniques in filmmaking, but there's also the issue of the entire film and the viewing experience, and that film has a structure. And experimental filmmakers, in my mind, are very focused on the idea of playing with or deconstructing narrative. But in order to do that, they have to be very proficient to understand how to construct narrative, as in commercial films, because how can you deconstruct something if you don't know how to construct it? The third point I'd make about this then is that this has led to certain techniques, some that Drake has talked about, which I have seen in experimental filmmakers' work that I find works its way into commercial cinema or television. One that sticks in my mind, for example, is the filmmaker Holly Fisher in 1984. She made films on optical printers where she showed multiple images in the frame. She would slow certain images down. And I think about like MTV. I think about some of these reality shows where you see now, like in these reality shows, where people will move slowly. I mean, where does that come from? In my mind, that all comes from the avant garde, but 20 years ago. The next point that I would make is that even though avant-garde and commercial cinema operate as completely separate economies, by that I mean I don't think there's one experimental filmmaker, or barely one, that could make a living from experimental films. I think they operate in different economic models entirely in terms of like where they're shown, how they're shown, and who sees them. But I think it's false to think that they are completely divorced from commercial cinema, because in fact, I think in practice, and coming back to the consciousness of the filmmakers, they're very closely linked. And I'd just like to leave you with one thought with some research I did about one filmmaker in particular, whose name is Mark Romanek. He made a film called 1 Hour Photo, which is Robin Williams at night in this photo lab. In research into an article I was doing, do you know what the one film he said that influenced him most stylistically about making that film? Was Stan Brackage's Mothlight, which is a film where Stan, a cameraless film where he's pasting butterfly wings and so on the film and then running it through the projector. So what I'm saying is, and I come back to this idea of perception, even though that film, 1 Hour Photo, doesn't have those abstract images. There's something about the consciousness of that filmmaker and the knowledge and awareness of those experimental films that affects the style of what he does. And I remember when we were talking, like Sarah the other day, you started mentioning all these films that influenced you, and I was like trying to scribble them all down, and they were all like experimental films. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, in your head and in your being, as well as other filmmakers, you know that history and you know that discourse.
Great. It's very interesting. I think perception is a really interesting thread to follow through. Yes. Is there something else you'd like to say, John?
Yeah, sorry, just one last point. I think the other thing, and thinking about this a really long time and talking to audiences, especially from my work at Tribeca, I also think it's from the point of view of the filmmakers and from the audience, it's a question of perception, not only of consciousness, but of perception and seeing. I think, and this is sort of an epiphany I've had in the last few years after working on this in decades, that the experimental filmmakers replicate more precisely how we experience reality than the commercial filmmakers do. And by that I mean, if you were sitting here in this audience, are you actually like staring at one person and, you know, tracking along like this? No, you're maybe thinking about, you know, what you had for breakfast this morning, and you're getting a little distracted, and you're looking at her, and then your eyes may get dizzy or out of focus, and you're looking up there. I mean, in a sense, I think experimental filmmakers are trying to address the issue of inner consciousness and how to express that in their images on the screen.
Yes. Yeah, I think I can hear the audience like all ready to talk about this. This is great. Thanks, John. I wanted to ask Roberta next, too, because Roberta has worked in so many of these different fields of avant garde. Does it have a particular meaning for you? You've worked in mainstream very much so, but in a sense, as a, quote, avant garde filmmaker, what do you think of that as a phrase?
Well, as we did, is this on? As we discussed this, earlier, closer, I told you I didn't want to try and define avant garde, and I do work both in feature film, documentary, and experimental film. But I feel that the term falls into a category of being essentially disputed, it being an essentially disputed concept. That is, that it's a term to be argued about, to be discussed, to be redefined, and that's something that we've been doing both on a phone call recently and behind the scenes earlier. It's very hard to absolutely define what that means, and it's constantly changing. Like, how do you define what is art? It's very interesting, and I think one of the things that'll come up after you hear what everyone else has to say, you'll find that that's true.
Yes. I think that's part of what the discussion really is about, is the sort of restlessness with this word, and there's more than one, experimental, avant-garde, mainstream. I mean, they're all very fluid, so I think it's a very good point. Like, even though you work as a, quote, avant-garde filmmaker, it's almost a meaningless kind of a word for you. Yes, it makes a lot of sense. So Ina, I wanted to go to you, because you mentioned when we talked earlier, when we were talking about various points, you were talking particularly about the using identity, using your own filmmaking, which uses, you take pieces from Hollywood films into a, quote, avant-garde frame of your filmmaking, and you're working with cultural identity, personal identity, and you talked about marginalized feelings. So what do you want to say about that?
Well, first of all, I want to say, whether or not I would define myself as an avant-garde or experimental filmmaker, I feel like I could do that by saying that I find nothing at all unusual about a giant disembodied head. So I feel like that in that way I might classify myself in that way.
That's years of experience of watching disembodied heads.
Exactly. and being perfectly comfortable with that. But I guess I have a blog, it's called Continuum Film Blog, and it's called Continuum because basically I feel that the two work back and forth. And I really have been so in love with mainstream film and engaged with it and always kind of consuming it, but realized that I was left out of those scenarios that I was so engaged with. And so experimental work and experimental and avant-garde strategies became a way to sort of insert myself into these narratives that I was being left out of, because I consider my work basically narrative films. They have a beginning, middle, and an end. Maybe the end comes before the beginning or in some other kind of format, but basically I'm trying to get the viewer from one place to another. And when we were talking about this, initially talking about this, I was thinking not only about my interaction with the mainstream, but whether or not marginalized audiences and makers might feel that experimental or avant-garde strategies might be the way to go to be able to address invisibility or narratives that are not expressed well in the mainstream by using these techniques, and actually in some sense vice versa too, because I feel like in the experimental category that sometimes the same, in the past at least, some of the same ellipses or things that were missing, stories that were missing, were also missing in the experimental category because of, of a greater interest in maybe structuralism, form, and that identity wasn't necessarily an issue that was being addressed consistently. So I feel like that's changing, or overtly, yes, and so I sometimes felt left out in both categories, but I feel, that by having the two sort of work together for me, that's where I've been able to kind of insert myself, and also think it might be an opportunity both for the mainstream to be able to include other narratives, and for the others to be able to find themselves in film, in the general cinema. So.
That's great. I love that notion of inserting oneself. I think that's terrific. There's an interesting theme coming up of just the notion of really telling a story and how you tell a story, which is certainly would straddle both these terms that we're looking at. So let me ask MM, you talked a lot about genres. You teach horror film and you teach avant-garde film, and the influence of avant-garde on genres, and also the influence of avant-garde on changing laws. So do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
And more, whatever else.
I would start with my name. I felt that being named Mary Magdalene in a puritanical Christian country, being named after a whore. How many of you have met someone named Mary Magdalene? You're like 6 years old and you're in first grade. I knew I was the other. I knew I was the outsider. And not only the outsider in terms of heteronormative capitalist system, but also in terms of being a lesbian or gay or whatever it is. So for me, I felt I had within me, inscribed within me, imprinted on my very being, is stories that I had to tell that weren't there, weren't present, and it's not identity politics, it's also class and race and being queer. It's a side of radical politics, and I knew it as a small child. I knew it when I would stand in church or I would meet people. And what I did is I looked at the, I don't know if I'm answering your question, the Italian Bible, and I saw Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and I thought, that's it. I'm going to be Michelangelo. I'm going to paint these bodies. Because Mary Magdalene was talking about the woman as flesh, or the person as flesh, the physicality, the explicit. And Drew mentioned that that I'm interested in drag. Flaming Creatures was an important film for me. In 1963, it's shot, not a date film stock. It has the erect phallus in it, and it has drag in it, but it's not drag queens. It's not like RuPaul, and it was illegal when it was shown. It's like the average homeless guy, toothless guy, who could be glamorous and gorgeous, with Jack Smith painting them, the glitter, the costumes. And for me, the avant-garde is personal vision. And it's about what you as an individual have to bring and have to say. And I think that it's not budget, because I've made films that for like $100. It's you start collecting, you start developing your ideas and building a vocabulary. That's what I did. And Flaming Creatures, Drew mentioned the law. Like when Flaming Creatures premiered, Jack left the theater because he knew they were going to be arrested. You needed a license. Drag was illegal. It was considered a perversion. And Jonas Mekas, the projectionist, the box office person, everybody went to jail, and you think, oh, going to jail, big deal, everyone. But at that time, Ken said he was scared. it was frightening because the police could beat them up. And now that made it to the front page of the Variety. And we have these articles like guys in girls' clothing arrested. And so now you have, like, I thought it was very brave of James Franco at the Academy Awards to come on stage, just even if it's for like 1 minute, even though he wasn't allowed to sing and dance. And he knows how to sing and dance. I knew he wanted to, but, stumbling out in high heels. It silenced the audience. And it silenced everybody. Including the people I was at the party, and they're like, "Who is that?" And so that it's almost like these thread of changes and people that take risks, and that's what I'm interested in, avant-garde. And for me, the term is like a French term, a soldier that goes into the unexplored territory, whether it's in content or aesthetics or it's who you are and what you're about, and you're willing to be able to take the risk. Does that make sense?
Very good. Yes, makes a lot of sense. Now we know all sorts of things about Jack Smith and James Franco. He's brought back to mind. We were all silenced by seeing him dressed as Marilyn Monroe. But it's a very interesting point when you think how in 1963, which is a fairly long time ago, but still that things that we just see, I mean, what's so interesting about drag particularly is, frankly, it's one of the most potent and most powerful parts of our culture right now. It flows through so many different things, and it has changed the way we look at clothing, the way we look at identity, the way we look at many things. So you have this seemingly small incident, but in fact you've illustrated a great point that, great things almost always start from very tiny incidences. So I think it's a really good illustration. So I want to finally ask Sara about this question. What does the avant-garde mean to you? And how do you feel when you talk about that word?
I feel very uncomfortable. I feel like categorizing anything, I think, is dangerous. And I think of avant-garde, independent, underground, experimental. Like after when I was first approached about this panel, I was like, okay, avant-garde, experimental, avant-garde, experimental. How do they? And then I got stuck in the underground. and then I thought about Stan Brakhage and how he really felt uncomfortable with avant-garde, and he liked the term poetic films. Also, and I think of avant-garde as films like Blood and the Poet, like Cocteau's films, or anemic cinema, or early films. I think of it as an old term. And then I looked at the program at the New York Film Festival, and I went, oh my God, it's great. They have an avant-garde section. And then my second thought was, wait a minute. Well, isn't Bellatar like avant-garde? I mean, why is he in the main section? I mean, what do you do? Or Lars von Trier, or you look at David Lynch, and David Lynch, like Inland Empire, is an extraordinary film. And they couldn't call that avant-garde, else people wouldn't come to see it, so they called it weird.
Then we all wanted to see it.
What?
Then we all wanted to come since it was
wanted
weird.
To see it then, right? And I wonder if this ghettoization of the avant-garde now is actually, because I find mainstream films really, really don't really have much enlightenment anymore, or much new ideas of telling stories in a new way in cinema. And I wonder if ghettoizing these films this way has affected the mainstream, so things don't flow into the mainstream anymore and affect the mainstream, which I think is very dangerous when you ghettoize films in this way. I think that's what I have to say.
Yeah, no, I think we're all
It's semantics.
riveted by that thought of, like, I think the whole thing is we've shaken the whole category of it. Everybody's going like, no, we can't have that category. But here's an interesting sort of angle on that, which is if avant-garde was, it could work both ways. Does being avant-garde and therefore having its own sort of category, does that actually serve a purpose for avant-garde? Perhaps in any of these that we've touched on, telling a story, political use, in identity politics, say, for instance, or in doing things that really push the line culturally, or in technological changes. Does it serve a purpose for avant-garde to stay, quote, sequestered, or is it actually a term that we've used in our discussions, you know, quote, ghettoized, that it pushes it out. I mean, how would you, any of you, want to answer if it was distributed differently, if it was named differently, would that be good for it or bad for it? MM.
I just want to say that you mentioned in my bio, I did this 7 programs called Counterculture, Counter Cinema. And I didn't call it an Avant Garde Film Festival, but Charles S. Cohen said, look, you're going to Los Angeles, and if you don't say it's Avant Garde, you're going to deceive the audience. It's not mainstream. You have to define it. And every time I was dealing with the press, they'll say an Avant Garde Film Festival. So he actually labeled it. He actually said, and experimental doesn't means to me playing with technique, like you're hand processing, you're scratching on films, but the Avant Garde was more wide range, and so I had to define it. I had to write it for the press, and so I put Avant Garde Film Festival because people seem to know that it means short films, it means films that are dealing with transgression, or I will say that Flaming Creatures was on the program, and that was the film that challenged the audience the most, because it's out of date film stock, it's grainy, it looks like it's painted on, and it has phallus in it, and visible. And there are still things that are tabooed and censored out of